I survived the plane crash they said killed me, but my wife had already collected the life insurance and remarried. I regained consciousness in a hospital bed in Port Moresby, Papua New Guinea, with no memory of how I'd gotten there. The nurse who checked my vitals spoke broken English and kept calling me John Doe, because I had no identification when fishermen had pulled me from the ocean 3 weeks earlier. My head was bandaged, my left leg was in a cast, and my ribs were wrapped tight enough that breathing hurt. When I finally managed to tell her my real name was Daniel Whitmore, she looked confused and said she'd get the doctor. Dr. Kiran Patel arrived 20 minutes later with a tablet showing news articles about Trans-Pacific Airlines Flight 494, which had crashed into the Pacific Ocean en route from Sydney to Los Angeles 6 weeks ago. All 237 passengers and crew were presumed dead. My name was on the passenger manifest. The doctor said I was the only survivor they'd found, unconscious and clinging to debris when local fishermen had spotted me drifting 40 miles off the coast. I'd been in a coma for 3 weeks with a severe head injury, multiple fractures, and internal bleeding they'd barely managed to stabilize with their limited resources. I asked Dr. Patel to contact my wife immediately to let her know I was alive. He nodded and said they'd been trying to identify me for weeks through dental records and fingerprints, but the local authorities lacked the resources and international connections to cross-reference databases efficiently. He'd personally call the American Embassy in Port Moresby and notify them that an American survivor of Flight 494 had been found. I gave him my wife's name, Rebecca Whitmore, and our home address in San Diego. I told him about my 2 daughters, Ella, who was 9, and Sophie, who was 7. I needed them to know I was alive, that I'd survived, that I was coming home. Dr. Patel promised to make the calls immediately and left me alone in the small hospital room with its rusted metal bed frame and single window overlooking a courtyard where palm trees swayed in the humid breeze. I stared at the ceiling and tried to remember the crash, but my memory stopped at boarding the plane in Sydney and started again with waking up in this bed. The American Embassy sent a representative 2 days later, a young consular officer named Thomas Ridley, who looked fresh out of college. He verified my identity through a series of questions about my background, checked my fingerprints against their database, and confirmed I was indeed Daniel Whitmore, age 41, resident of San Diego, married to Rebecca Whitmore, father of 2 daughters. He looked uncomfortable as he pulled out a folder and explained that there were complications with my reappearance. The airline had officially declared all passengers deceased 6 weeks ago after extensive search and recovery operations found no survivors. Death certificates had been issued for all passengers, including me. My life insurance policy through my employer, Coastal Engineering Solutions, had paid out $2 million to Rebecca as my beneficiary. The expression on Ridley's face told me there was more he wasn't saying. I asked him to tell me everything, and he hesitated before explaining that Rebecca had filed the death claim immediately after the crash was confirmed, received the payout within 4 weeks, due to clear evidence of death via airline manifest and lack of survivors, and had remarried 3 days ago to a man named Graham Fletcher. The information hit me with more force than the plane crash I couldn't remember. 3 days ago, 6 weeks after I'd supposedly died, Rebecca had moved on with stunning speed, collected $2 million on my death, and married someone else while I was lying in a hospital bed fighting to survive in a foreign country. Ridley said he'd been instructed by the embassy to handle my repatriation carefully because my reappearance created significant legal and financial complications. The insurance company would want their money back. Rebecca and her new husband would face potential fraud charges if they'd known I was alive. The airline would face liability issues for declaring me dead prematurely. My return to the United States needed to be coordinated with multiple agencies to manage the legal fallout. I told him I didn't care about the legal complications. I just wanted to go home to my daughters. Ridley said he understood, but I'd need to be patient while they arranged transportation and prepared the necessary documentation to legally resurrect me from official death. It took another week before I was medically cleared to fly, and the embassy had processed emergency travel documents. During that week, I tried calling Rebecca's cell phone dozens of times, but the number was disconnected. I tried calling our home phone and got a message saying the number was no longer in service. I found our home address online and called neighbors whose numbers I could locate through directory services, but no one answered or they claimed not to know the Whitmore family. The isolation was maddening. I was alive but couldn't reach the people who mattered most to me. Ridley explained that the embassy had made official notification to Rebecca through the San Diego Police Department that I was alive and would be returning home. He said she'd been informed 3 days ago, which meant she'd known I was alive for 3 days and hadn't tried to contact me. That silence felt like a message in itself. When I finally boarded the flight back to Los Angeles, accompanied by an embassy escort to help navigate customs and media attention, I was terrified about what I'd find when I got home. The media was waiting at LAX. Somehow, word had leaked that a survivor of Flight 494 had been found, and reporters mobbed me the moment I emerged from the international terminal. Camera flashes blinded me as journalists shouted questions about the crash, about surviving in the ocean, about my wife remarrying while I was missing. My escort, a State Department official named Angela Porter, pushed through the crowd and got me into a waiting car. She explained that the story had broken on social media 2 days ago when someone at the Papua New Guinea hospital had posted about the American crash survivor. From there, news outlets had connected the dots and identified me. My reappearance was international news. The airline was issuing statements about their thorough search efforts and expressing relief that I'd survived. The insurance company was declining to comment on pending matters. Rebecca's lawyer had released a statement saying she'd acted in good faith based on official death declarations and was relieved I was alive. That last part felt empty and lawyered, carefully worded to avoid admitting anything that could be used against her. Angela drove me to a hotel near the airport instead of taking me directly home. She explained that the State Department recommended I not go to my house immediately because the media would follow me there and create a circus. She'd arranged for my daughters to be brought to the hotel so I could see them in private before dealing with the legal and media complications of my return. I waited in a hotel conference room, pacing and anxious, until the door opened and Ella and Sophie walked in with a woman I didn't recognize. The girls stood frozen for several seconds, staring at me with expressions I couldn't read. Not joy or relief, but shock and something that looked almost like fear. I knelt down and opened my arms, expecting them to run to me, but they stayed where they were. Sophie started crying, and Ella looked at the woman who'd brought them, a blonde woman in her 30s who stepped forward and introduced herself as Michelle, Graham Fletcher's sister. She said she'd been helping Rebecca with the girls during the transition. I asked where Rebecca was, why she hadn't brought the girls herself. Michelle's expression was carefully neutral, as she explained that Rebecca thought it would be better if I saw the girls first, without the additional stress of dealing with her presence. She said Rebecca was prepared to discuss everything with me, but wanted to prioritize the children's needs before addressing the complicated adult situations. The diplomatic phrasing sounded rehearsed, and I realized Rebecca had sent this woman as a buffer to avoid facing me directly. I ignored Michelle and focused on my daughters, telling them I'd missed them, that I'd been hurt in the crash but was okay now, that I'd been trying to get home to them as soon as I could. Ella, who'd always been the more verbal and confident of the two, finally spoke. "Mom said you were dead. We had a funeral. We saw your coffin." Her voice was flat, accusatory, as if I'd personally betrayed her by not actually being in that coffin. Sophie just kept crying, pressing her face against Michelle's leg instead of coming to me. I tried to explain that I'd been unconscious in a hospital far away, that no one knew I'd survived, that I'd come back as soon as I could. But even as I said it, I could see they didn't fully understand or believe me. To them, I'd been dead for 6 weeks. They'd mourned me, adjusted to life without me, and now I was back disrupting the grief they'd processed and the new normal they'd built. Michelle said gently that this was a lot for young children to handle, and perhaps we should keep this first meeting short. She suggested I plan to see them again tomorrow after they'd had time to process. I wanted to argue, wanted to demand more time with my own daughters, but I could see they were overwhelmed and frightened. I agreed to let Michelle take them home, and I watched them leave without either girl hugging me or telling me they loved me. The rejection from my own children was somehow worse than everything else that had happened since I'd regained consciousness. Angela returned after Michelle and the girls left and explained what would happen next. The insurance company, Pacific Mutual Life, had filed an emergency petition with the courts to freeze all assets purchased with the life insurance payout pending resolution of my case. They were demanding full repayment of the $2 million plus interest and legal fees. Rebecca's lawyer had filed a counter-motion arguing that she'd acted in good faith based on official declarations from the airline and government, and that she shouldn't be penalized for circumstances beyond her control. The house Rebecca and I had owned jointly had been sold 3 weeks ago as part of what she'd described in the sale documents as settling estate affairs. The proceeds from that sale, approximately $650,000 after paying off the mortgage, had been deposited into accounts I no longer had access to. Rebecca had also liquidated my retirement accounts and investment portfolios, actions she'd been legally entitled to make as my widow and beneficiary. In total, she'd collected and spent or moved nearly $3 million of assets that had been mine or ours jointly. I asked Angela how Rebecca could have done all this in just 6 weeks. She explained that death certificates for accident victims, particularly in cases with clear evidence like airline manifests and no possibility of survival, could be processed quickly. California law allowed expedited probate for surviving spouses in straightforward cases. The insurance company had paid out fast because they had documentary proof of death and no reason to delay. Everything had been legal and procedurally correct based on the information available at the time. The problem was that I wasn't actually dead, which meant all those legal actions were now void or questionable. Rebecca would almost certainly have to return the insurance money, but recovering the other assets would be complicated because some had already been spent or transferred. Angela said, I needed to hire a lawyer immediately, someone who specialized in probate and insurance law. She gave me names of attorneys the State Department had worked with before, and I made calls from the hotel room that evening. The lawyer I retained, Patricia Voss, was a sharp woman in her 50s who'd handled complex estate disputes for 20 years. She met me at the hotel the next morning and laid out the brutal reality of my situation. I was legally alive again, which meant my death certificate would be voided and my legal status restored. But that didn't automatically reverse all the actions Rebecca had taken while I was legally dead. The life insurance company would definitely get their money back because their policy was clear that payment was contingent on actual death, and I wasn't dead. but Rebecca had already spent approximately $800,000 of that money on a new house she'd purchased with Graham, new cars, paying off debts, and other expenses. Even if she sold everything immediately, she'd lose money on the forced sales and couldn't fully repay the $2 million. She and Graham would likely face personal bankruptcy. The retirement accounts and investment portfolios I'd held were more complicated because Rebecca had been legally entitled to liquidate them as my widow, and the institutions that had allowed those transactions weren't at fault. Patricia explained that I could sue Rebecca for conversion of assets and fraudulent transfer if I could prove she'd known I was alive when she collected the insurance money. But proving that would be extremely difficult unless I had evidence she'd known about my survival before filing the claim. The timeline suggested she'd acted quickly, but within legal bounds. Flight 494 had crashed on March 15th. The airline had declared all passengers deceased on March 18th after search operations found no survivors. Rebecca had filed the insurance claim on March 20th. The insurance company had paid out on April 12th, exactly 28 days later. Rebecca had remarried on May 8th, 54 days after the crash. The speed was suspicious, but not necessarily proof of fraud. People grieved differently, and some moved on quickly, particularly if they'd been unhappy in their previous marriage. I told Patricia that Rebecca and I had been happy, that our marriage had been stable, that there was no reason for her to move on this fast unless something else was going on. Patricia said we'd need to investigate Graham Fletcher and determine when his relationship with Rebecca had actually begun. The private investigator Patricia recommended was a former FBI agent named Raymond Cole, who specialized in financial crimes and infidelity cases. He dug into Graham Fletcher's background and uncovered information that made everything click into place. Graham was a financial planner who'd worked at the same firm where Rebecca had been employed as an investment analyst before our daughters were born. They'd been colleagues for 3 years before Rebecca left work to stay home with Ella. Graham had left that firm 5 years ago to start his own practice, but he and Rebecca had apparently stayed in touch. Raymond found social media evidence showing they'd commented on each other's posts regularly over the years, more frequently than would be typical for former co-workers. He found restaurant receipts and credit card records showing Graham had paid for lunches and dinners with Rebecca going back 18 months, always at locations far enough from our neighborhood that I wouldn't accidentally encounter them. The pattern suggested an affair that had been ongoing long before my supposed death. Raymond also discovered that Graham had significant gambling debts. He owed approximately $240,000 to various creditors and had been facing potential bankruptcy before Rebecca's insurance payout had arrived. Immediately after Rebecca received the $2 million, she'd transferred $300,000 to Graham's accounts, which he'd used to pay off his debts and settle with creditors. The timing was damning. Rebecca had known Graham needed money. She'd received a windfall from my death. She'd immediately shared that windfall with him. They'd purchased a house together for $750,000 in cash, no mortgage, putting both their names on the title. They'd married within 2 months of the crash. The evidence suggested they'd been planning this for some time, possibly waiting for an opportunity, and my death in a plane crash had provided that opportunity. But the question remained, had they simply taken advantage of a tragic accident, or had they done something more deliberate? I met with Raymond at his office to review his findings. He spread out timelines, bank records, and surveillance photos across his conference table. He explained that proving Rebecca and Graham had orchestrated the plane crash was impossible because the crash investigation had conclusively determined it was caused by mechanical failure, not sabotage. The aircraft had experienced catastrophic engine failure, leading to loss of control and impact with the ocean. There was no evidence of bombs, tampering, or foul play. But Raymond said there was another possibility worth investigating. He'd found evidence that Rebecca had been searching online for information about life insurance payouts and death declarations in the weeks before my trip to Sydney. Her search history, which he'd obtained through a subpoena Patricia had filed as part of our civil case, showed she'd researched how long it took for insurance companies to pay death claims, what documentation was required, and whether death certificates could be issued without recovering bodies. She'd also searched for information about remarriage waiting periods and community property laws in California. The search history suggested premeditation, but not of the crash itself. Rebecca couldn't have caused the crash, but she'd been preparing for the possibility of my death and knew exactly what steps to take if it happened. Raymond pointed out something else interesting. I'd booked my flight to Sydney for a work conference only 3 days before departure, using miles and a last-minute booking because my original plans had changed. But Rebecca's internet searches about death claims and insurance payouts had occurred 2 weeks before I'd even known I was going to Sydney. That timeline didn't make sense unless she'd known something I hadn't. I thought back to those weeks before the trip and remembered that Rebecca had been the one who'd suggested I attend the Sydney conference. She'd mentioned it casually one evening, saying she'd seen an email about it forwarded from my work and thought it would be good for my career. I'd dismissed it initially because of the cost and short notice, but she'd encouraged me to check if I had enough miles to book the flight. She'd effectively pushed me onto that plane. Patricia filed an emergency motion to depose Rebecca and Graham under oath regarding their relationship timeline, their financial transactions, and Rebecca's knowledge of my travel plans. The motion argued that evidence suggested Rebecca had been prepared for my death in ways that indicated foreknowledge or planning. Graham's lawyer, a slick corporate attorney named Douglas Finch, fought the deposition, arguing it was a fishing expedition designed to harass his clients during an already difficult time. But the judge, A no-nonsense woman named Judith Ramirez, reviewed the evidence Patricia had compiled and ordered both Rebecca and Graham to appear for depositions within 2 weeks. The order also froze all of their assets pending resolution of the insurance company's claim and my civil suit. Rebecca and Graham couldn't sell the house, couldn't access their bank accounts beyond basic living expenses, and couldn't transfer any assets without court approval. The financial pressure was immediate and intense. The first deposition was Graham's, held at Patricia's law office with court reporters and video recording equipment capturing every word. Graham appeared confident initially, dressed in an expensive suit and projecting the polished professionalism of a financial advisor. Patricia started with basic questions about his relationship with Rebecca, when they'd met, how often they'd communicated over the years. Graham admitted they'd been colleagues and had stayed in touch after he'd left their shared employer, but characterized it as professional networking and friendship. Patricia showed him the restaurant receipts and asked him to explain why he'd paid for 14 lunches and dinners with Rebecca over 18 months, spending an average of $120 per meal. Graham claimed they'd been discussing potential business opportunities, that Rebecca had been interested in returning to work, and he'd been mentoring her. Patricia asked why these mentoring sessions had occurred at restaurants an hour from Rebecca's home, rather than convenient locations. Graham said they'd wanted privacy to discuss sensitive career matters without running into people from their old firm. Patricia pivoted to Graham's financial situation and asked about his gambling debts. Graham's confidence cracked slightly, as he admitted he'd had some financial difficulties but characterized them as temporary cash flow problems, not gambling addiction. Patricia showed him bank statements and credit card records documenting $240,000 in debts to casinos, bookmakers, and online gambling sites. She asked how he'd planned to repay those debts before Rebecca's insurance payout had arrived. Graham claimed he'd been negotiating payment plans and consolidation loans. Patricia showed him the $300,000 transfer from Rebecca to his account dated April 15th, 3 days after the insurance payout had been deposited. She asked what Rebecca had told him the money was for. Graham said Rebecca had wanted to help him get back on his feet, as they were planning a future together. Patricia asked when exactly they'd started planning that future. Graham hesitated, and his lawyer jumped in to remind him not to speculate about Rebecca's state of mind. Patricia rephrased, asking when Graham had first discussed marriage with Rebecca. Graham said they'd talked about it hypothetically over the past year, but had only gotten serious about it after my death had freed Rebecca to move forward. Patricia asked Graham directly if he'd been having an affair with Rebecca while she was married to me. Graham denied it, claiming their relationship had been platonic until after my death, at which point they'd grown closer through shared grief and mutual support. Patricia showed him text messages between Graham and Rebecca that Raymond had obtained through the subpoena, messages dating back 14 months that included terms of endearment, discussions of a future together, and complaints about obstacles preventing them from being together. One message from Rebecca sent 8 months before the crash read, "I wish we could just be together without all these complications. Sometimes I fantasize about being free." Graham's face went red as he read the messages. He claimed they'd been taken out of context, that the relationship had been emotional but not physical, and that they'd never acted on their feelings while Rebecca was married. Patricia asked if he considered planning a future with a married woman and accepting $300,000 of her late husband's insurance money to be appropriate behavior for a financial advisor who supposedly specialized in ethics and fiduciary responsibility. Rebecca's deposition 2 days later was even more contentious. She arrived with her own lawyer, a woman named Carolyn Moss, who had a reputation for defending clients in high-profile divorce cases. Rebecca looked different than I remembered. She'd cut her hair short, lost weight, and was wearing expensive jewelry I'd never seen before. When I entered the conference room where the deposition was being held, she wouldn't meet my eyes. Patricia started with questions about our marriage, asking Rebecca to describe our relationship in the months before the crash. Rebecca said we'd been growing apart, that I'd been focused on work, and had been emotionally distant. She claimed we'd discussed separation, but hadn't made any formal decisions. I wanted to scream that this was a lie, that our marriage had been fine, but Patricia had instructed me to stay silent during the deposition. Patricia asked Rebecca when she'd first reconnected with Graham Fletcher. Rebecca said they'd run into each other at a professional conference 2 years ago and had started meeting occasionally to catch up as old friends. Patricia showed Rebecca the same restaurant receipts and text messages she'd shown Graham, asking Rebecca to explain the nature of her relationship with him. Rebecca admitted the relationship had become emotionally intimate but insisted they'd never been physically involved while I was alive. She claimed she'd been struggling with feelings for Graham but had been committed to her marriage and her family. Patricia asked about the text message expressing wishes to be free. Rebecca said it had been sent during a difficult moment when she'd been feeling overwhelmed by the responsibilities of parenting and managing the household, not a wish for my death. Patricia asked when Rebecca had first searched online for information about life insurance payouts. Rebecca's lawyer objected, claiming the question was irrelevant and designed to prejudice the record. Patricia argued that Rebecca's internet searches 2 weeks before I'd boarded Flight 494 were directly relevant to establishing whether she'd had foreknowledge or expectations about my death. Judge Ramirez, participating via video conference, ordered Rebecca to answer. Rebecca admitted she'd searched for information about life insurance but claimed it had been general research she'd done while organizing our financial documents, not preparation for filing a claim. Patricia asked why she'd researched death certificate procedures and remarriage waiting periods if it was just general financial organization. Rebecca said she'd been worried about mortality generally after a friend's husband had died unexpectedly, and she'd wanted to understand what would be involved if something happened to me. Patricia asked if she'd discussed these concerns with me, and Rebecca admitted she hadn't. Patricia asked why Rebecca had encouraged me to attend the Sydney conference when I'd initially been reluctant to go. Rebecca said she'd thought it would be good for my career and hadn't wanted me to miss opportunities. Patricia asked if Rebecca had known that Flight 494 had a history of mechanical issues. Rebecca said she hadn't known anything about the specific plane, that she'd simply encouraged me to attend a work conference. Patricia showed her records indicating that Trans-Pacific Airlines had received multiple maintenance complaints about that specific aircraft in the 6 months before the crash, complaints that had been reported in aviation industry publications. Patricia asked if Rebecca, as a former investment analyst who'd been trained to research companies before making financial decisions, had done any research about Trans-Pacific Airlines or their safety record before I'd booked the flight. Rebecca said she hadn't, that she'd assumed all airlines were equally safe. Patricia asked why Rebecca had filed the life insurance claim only 2 days after I'd been declared dead, before any memorial service or funeral had been held. Rebecca said she'd been advised by her financial advisor, Graham Fletcher, that filing quickly was important to avoid delays in processing. Patricia asked if Graham had helped her prepare the insurance claim. Rebecca admitted he had, walking her through the documentation requirements and helping her compile the necessary forms. Patricia asked how much of the $2 million insurance payout Rebecca had shared with Graham. Rebecca's lawyer objected again, but Judge Ramirez ordered her to answer. Rebecca admitted she'd given Graham $300,000 to help with financial difficulties, but characterized it as a loan that he was planning to repay over time. Patricia asked when Rebecca and Graham had first discussed marriage. Rebecca said the conversation had come up naturally a few weeks after my death, when they'd been supporting each other through grief. Patricia asked if Rebecca had grieved for me at all, given that she'd remarried 54 days after my supposed death. Rebecca started crying, saying that everyone grieved differently, and that moving forward with Graham had been her way of coping with loss and creating stability for her daughters. Patricia asked if Rebecca had attempted to contact me after being notified by the San Diego Police Department that I was alive and returning from Papua New Guinea. Rebecca admitted she hadn't, saying she'd been in shock and hadn't known what to say. Patricia asked if Rebecca had immediately consulted with lawyers after receiving notification of my survival. Rebecca said she'd sought legal advice because she'd been frightened about the implications and needed guidance about how to handle the situation. Patricia asked if Rebecca's first priority had been protecting the money she'd received or reuniting with her supposedly beloved husband, who'd miraculously survived a plane crash. Rebecca didn't answer, just continued crying while her lawyer called for a break. During the break, Patricia pulled me aside and said Rebecca's deposition was providing excellent material for proving she'd acted in bad faith, even if we couldn't prove she'd actively orchestrated anything. The timeline, the internet searches, the encouragement to take the flight, the immediate insurance claim, the quick remarriage, and the money transferred to Graham all painted a picture of someone who'd been prepared for my death and had benefited substantially from it. Whether she'd actively caused anything or simply been ready to capitalize on opportunity, she'd demonstrated a pattern of behavior that was inconsistent with a grieving widow acting in good faith. The insurance company's lawyer, who'd been observing the depositions, told Patricia they were prepared to file criminal fraud charges against Rebecca and Graham for insurance fraud and conspiracy. The evidence suggested they'd made material misrepresentations in the insurance claim by failing to disclose their affair and financial entanglement, which would have been relevant to the company's investigation. When the deposition resumed, Patricia focused on Rebecca's relationship with our daughters. She asked how Ella and Sophie had reacted to news of my death. Rebecca described them as devastated, particularly Ella, who'd been very close to me. Patricia asked how Rebecca had explained my death to them. Rebecca said she'd told them I'd been in a plane crash and had died, that my body had been lost in the ocean, but that we knew for certain I wasn't coming back. Patricia asked how the girls had reacted when Rebecca introduced them to Graham. Rebecca said they'd already known Graham as a family friend, so his presence hadn't been unusual. Patricia asked when Graham had first stayed overnight at the house. Rebecca hesitated before admitting that Graham had stayed over a few times in the weeks after the crash to help with the girls and provide emotional support. Patricia asked if it had seemed appropriate to have her affair partner staying overnight in the home where her supposedly dead husband's children were grieving their father. Rebecca's lawyer objected to the characterization, but the damage was done. Patricia asked when Rebecca had told the girls she was marrying Graham. Rebecca said she'd told them about a week before the wedding, framing it as something positive that would give them a stable family structure again. Patricia asked how the girls had reacted. Rebecca admitted that Ella had been upset and had said she didn't want a new daddy, but that Rebecca had explained it wasn't about replacing me, it was about moving forward. Patricia asked how Rebecca had explained my sudden reappearance to the girls. Rebecca said she'd told them there had been a mistake, that I'd been hurt in the crash but hadn't died, and that I was coming home. Patricia asked if Rebecca had prepared them to see me or had helped them process the confusion of having a father return from the dead. Rebecca said she'd done her best, but admitted she'd been overwhelmed by the situation. Patricia asked if Rebecca had considered that her actions had traumatized her children by telling them I was dead when she apparently hadn't been certain. then remarrying within weeks, then having me reappear alive. Rebecca started crying again and said she'd made mistakes but had been trying to do what was best for her family. The depositions concluded with both Rebecca and Graham on record admitting to the affair, the financial entanglement, and the rushed remarriage. Patricia filed an amended complaint, adding claims for intentional infliction of emotional distress, fraud, and conspiracy to defraud. The insurance company filed criminal complaints with the district attorney's office requesting investigation of insurance fraud. The DA assigned a prosecutor named Victor Ruiz, who specialized in white-collar crime. He reviewed the evidence and convened a grand jury to determine whether criminal charges were warranted. I testified before the grand jury about my marriage, the circumstances of my trip, and what I'd discovered upon returning. Raymond testified about his investigation findings. Patricia testified about the legal timeline and the suspicious speed of Rebecca's actions. The grand jury returned indictments charging Rebecca and Graham with insurance fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, and making false statements in insurance claims. The criminal charges changed everything. Rebecca and Graham could now face up to 10 years in prison if convicted. The publicity around the case intensified, with news outlets running stories about the wife who'd remarried after her husband's plane crash only to have him return alive and discover her betrayal. Social media was brutal in its judgment of Rebecca, with thousands of comments calling her evil, calculating, and heartless. Some defended her, arguing she'd acted reasonably based on official death declarations and shouldn't be criminalized for moving on with her life. But the majority sided with me, particularly after details about the affair and Graham's gambling debts became public. Rebecca and Graham both pleaded not guilty and hired a high-powered criminal defense attorney named Richard Clayton, who immediately went on the offensive. He filed motions to suppress evidence, arguing that the subpoenas Patricia had obtained were overly broad and violated his client's privacy rights. He argued that internet search history and private text messages were protected communications that shouldn't be admitted in a criminal trial. Judge Margaret Torres, who'd been assigned the criminal case, heard arguments and ruled that most of the evidence could be admitted because the fraud investigation was legitimate and the communications were relevant to establishing intent and knowledge. Clayton then shifted tactics and began settlement negotiations with Prosecutor Ruiz, offering to have Rebecca and Graham plead guilty to reduce charges in exchange for probation instead of prison time. Ruiz consulted with me about whether I'd accept a plea deal or wanted to proceed to trial. I told him I wanted the truth exposed in court, wanted a jury to hear everything Rebecca and Graham had done, and render judgment. Ruiz said he appreciated my position, but warned that trials were unpredictable and that there was some risk a jury might sympathize with Rebecca's argument that she'd acted in good faith based on official death declarations. A plea deal would guarantee convictions and restitution, even if the sentences were lighter than we might achieve at trial. I reluctantly agreed to consider a plea offer if it included substantial restitution and admissions of guilt that would help my civil case. Clayton came back with an offer. Rebecca and Graham would plead guilty to conspiracy to commit insurance fraud and making false statements. They'd receive 3 years probation, 500 hours community service, and would be jointly and severally liable for repaying the $2 million insurance payout plus interest and legal fees. They'd also have to forfeit the house they'd purchased together and any other assets purchased with the insurance money. Rebecca would agree to a custody arrangement giving me primary custody of Ella and Sophie, with her receiving limited supervised visitation until the girls were ready for more. Graham would agree to stay away from my daughters entirely. The deal included admissions that they'd been having an affair before my supposed death, that they'd financially benefited from my death, and that they'd made material misrepresentations to the insurance company. Ruiz recommended I accept it because the restitution terms were strong and the admissions would eliminate most of my burden of proof in the civil case. I accepted the plea deal, even though part of me wanted to watch Rebecca and Graham face trial and potentially prison time. Patricia explained that the civil case could still proceed to recover additional damages beyond the insurance repayment, particularly for the retirement accounts and other assets Rebecca had liquidated. The house Rebecca and I had owned together had been sold for $650,000, and she'd deposited those proceeds in accounts I couldn't access. The plea deal required her to return those funds, plus the approximately $400,000 in retirement savings she'd liquidated. The new house she'd purchased with Graham was being sold, and the equity would go toward the insurance repayment. After accounting for all assets and liabilities, Rebecca and Graham would emerge from this essentially bankrupt, having lost everything and facing years of probation and debt. Rebecca's parents had to take her in because she couldn't afford rent. Graham moved into a friend's spare bedroom and was trying to rebuild his financial planning business, though most of his clients had left after the criminal charges became public. The custody battle was surprisingly straightforward. Given Rebecca's criminal conviction and the evidence that she'd prioritized her affair over her children's emotional well-being, the family court judge awarded me primary physical custody, with Rebecca receiving supervised visitation every other weekend. The girls' therapist testified that both Ella and Sophie were struggling with trust issues related to their mother's deceptions and needed time to rebuild that relationship in a controlled environment. Rebecca cried when the custody order was read, saying she'd never intended to lose her daughters. But the judge noted that Rebecca's choices had consequences, and those consequences included her children losing trust in her. Graham was prohibited from any contact with the girls unless they specifically requested to see him when they were older and ready to process that relationship, which seemed unlikely given the circumstances. The judge also ordered Rebecca to pay child support based on imputed income, meaning she was expected to return to work and contribute financially, despite her probation and bankruptcy. Rebuilding my relationship with Ella and Sophie took months. They were angry with me for disrupting their lives again, even though the disruption wasn't my fault. Ella particularly struggled with feeling she'd been made to grieve for no reason, that her sadness about my death had been wasted emotion. The therapist explained this was common in children dealing with ambiguous loss and resurrection scenarios. They'd processed my death, created new attachments to Graham as a father figure, and then had to process losing Graham and re-establishing connection with me. Sophie was younger and adapted more quickly, gradually warming back up to me and accepting that I was her real father, who'd been hurt, but had come home. Ella took longer, questioning why I'd stayed away so long, why I hadn't tried harder to come home sooner. I explained repeatedly about the coma, the remote hospital, the limited resources, but logic didn't erase her feelings of abandonment and confusion. We attended family therapy every week, working through issues of trust, attachment, and grief. The therapist helped the girls express their anger and confusion in safe ways. She helped me understand that my reappearance had been traumatic for them, not joyful, because it meant everything they'd believed about their family and their mother had been lies. They'd lost both parents in different ways, me to a plane crash and recovery, their mother to betrayal and criminality. Rebuilding took patience and consistency. I showed up for every therapy session, every school event, every bedtime routine. I proved through daily presence that I was back and staying. Gradually, Ella's walls began to come down. She started asking me questions about the crash, about what I remembered, about how I'd felt when I'd learned about Rebecca and Graham. I answered honestly but age-appropriately, explaining that adults sometimes made terrible choices that hurt the people they were supposed to love. I told her that her mother's choices were about her mother's problems, not about anything Ella or Sophie had done wrong. Patricia's civil case concluded with a settlement that recovered most of the assets Rebecca had liquidated. The retirement accounts, investment portfolios, and house sale proceeds were returned to me, minus legal fees and the portions Rebecca had already spent. The total recovery was approximately $2.1 million, including the insurance repayment, which meant I emerged financially whole even if emotionally scarred. I used part of the money to buy a new house in a good school district, deliberately choosing a neighborhood far from where Rebecca and Graham lived. I set up college funds for the girls that Rebecca couldn't access. I hired a nanny to help with childcare since I was returning to work at Coastal Engineering Solutions, who'd welcomed me back with a promotion and public statements about being thrilled to have me alive. The attention from my resurrection had been good publicity for the company, and they'd leveraged it into news coverage about their engineering work and safety standards. I hated being a corporate mascot, but appreciated the job security and salary increase. The first anniversary of the crash was emotionally brutal. Media outlets ran retrospective stories about Flight 494 and included segments about my survival and Rebecca's betrayal. I received interview requests from morning shows, podcasts, and documentary filmmakers wanting to tell my story. I declined most of them, agreeing only to a single print interview with a journalist I trusted who promised to focus on survival and resilience rather than tabloid drama. The article that resulted was thoughtful and well-received, discussing the psychological impact of being declared dead, the challenges of legal resurrection, and the process of rebuilding trust with traumatized children. Rebecca reached out through her lawyer asking if I'd be willing to speak with her privately, off the record, to help her understand what had happened and find closure. I declined. I had nothing to say to her that wasn't documented in legal proceedings, and giving her closure wasn't my responsibility. 2 years after the crash, Ella and Sophie had adjusted to their new normal. Ella was in middle school, excelling academically but still dealing with anxiety about abandonment. She went to therapy weekly and had learned coping strategies for when she felt overwhelmed. Sophie was in elementary school, cheerful and affectionate, with fewer obvious scars from the trauma. They saw Rebecca twice a month for supervised visits that gradually became less supervised as the girls demonstrated they were comfortable. Rebecca had gotten a job doing bookkeeping for a small accounting firm and was slowly rebuilding her life. She'd completed her probation requirements and was paying off the remaining debts through a court-approved payment plan that would take another decade to resolve. Graham had moved to another state, last I'd heard, trying to start over somewhere his name wasn't associated with fraud and betrayal. I didn't follow his life and didn't care what happened to him beyond ensuring he stayed away from my daughters. The plane crash survivor support group I'd joined helped me process the unique trauma of surviving something that had killed hundreds of others. Other survivors dealt with guilt, hypervigilance, and difficulty, returning to normal life. I dealt with all that, plus the additional layer of having my survival used against me by the person I'd trusted most. The group understood in ways my regular therapist couldn't. They'd all experienced the moment of realizing they'd survived something unsurvivable, the disorientation of returning to a world that had moved on without them. We shared strategies for managing anniversary reactions, dealing with unwanted media attention, and explaining our experiences to people who couldn't possibly understand. One man in the group had survived a train derailment that killed his wife. He talked about the guilt of being alive when she wasn't, and I understood that guilt, even though my situation had been different. Survival always came with complicated emotions that didn't fit neat narratives. I started dating again 3 years after the crash, cautiously and with extensive vetting of potential partners. My therapist said I had trust issues, which seemed like an understatement given my wife had celebrated my death and stolen my assets. The woman I eventually connected with was named Allison Kent, a middle school teacher who'd been divorced for 5 years and had a son Ella's age. She was patient with my wariness and didn't push for faster commitment than I was ready to give. We'd been dating for 8 months before I introduced her to the girls, and another 6 months before we discussed moving in together. Ella was suspicious initially, questioning whether I was replacing their mother the way their mother had replaced me. I explained that I wasn't replacing anyone, that people could have multiple meaningful relationships in their lives, that loving Allison didn't mean I'd loved Rebecca less at the time, or that I was trying to erase their mother from their history. Sophie liked Allison immediately, gravitating toward her warmth and easy affection. 4 years after the crash, I married Allison in a small ceremony with close family and friends. Ella and Sophie were bridesmaids, wearing matching dresses they'd picked out themselves. Rebecca sent a card congratulating me and expressing hope that I'd found happiness, which felt both gracious and absurd given what she'd done. I didn't respond. Allison and I bought a larger house with room for her son and my daughters, creating a blended family that functioned surprisingly well despite the complicated histories everyone brought to it. Allison's ex-husband was involved in his son's life, but was supportive of the new arrangement, which made co-parenting easier. The 4 kids got along well, forming sibling bonds that gave Ella and Sophie additional stability and connection. We established routines, traditions, and inside jokes that made us feel like a cohesive unit rather than fragments from broken families forced together. The legal aftermath of my resurrection continued for years. The airline faced multiple lawsuits from families of other passengers, questioning whether they'd declared victims dead prematurely, whether better search and recovery efforts might have found me sooner, and whether systemic failures had contributed to the crash itself. The airline settled most cases out of court, paying substantial damages and agreeing to improve their search protocols and death declaration procedures. The insurance industry revised their policies on rapid payouts for mass casualty events, implementing additional verification requirements before distributing large death benefits. My case had exposed vulnerabilities in systems designed for efficiency rather than accuracy. Changes made in response would potentially prevent future Rebecca Whitmores from capitalizing on presumed deaths before certainty was established. Small comfort for what I'd been through, but meaningful progress nonetheless. 5 years after the crash, I stood in our backyard watching Ella graduate from 8th grade. She'd transformed from the frightened, angry girl who'd watched her father return from the dead into a confident teenager preparing for high school. She'd maintained limited contact with Rebecca, seeing her once a month for coffee and conversation that Ella controlled. She'd told me recently that she'd forgiven her mother for the betrayal, not because her mother deserved forgiveness, but because carrying anger was exhausting. Sophie had flourished into a happy 12-year-old who talked incessantly about her friends, her hobbies, and her plans for the future. Both girls called Allison by her first name, but treated her with the respect and affection they'd give a parent who'd earned their trust through consistent presence. I'd survived the unsurvivable twice, first the plane crash, then the discovery that my wife had celebrated my death. But what I'd built from the wreckage was real, honest, and worth preserving. Sometimes the worst betrayals create space for better things, and resurrection means not just returning to life, but building a life worth living. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.